Good morning. I had the opportunity to introduce myself to many of you, but not all of you. My name is Vic Menaris. I'm the director for the Center for Law and Human Behavior. And so part of this symposium, or part of this grant, falls under our Center for Law and Human Behavior. And our center is really geared at the Homeland Security enterprise and law enforcement in general on that. So all of our research is focused in those areas to be able to do things that hopefully improve the life of the men and women that are particularly represented by this population on that. So we're real happy to bring stuff like this that's an interest to all of you. Now, some of the items that you ought to know, the coffee and tea's outside. You help yourself as much as you like. The straight down the hall and to the right are the restrooms. If you need to use those, and then you should have received some packets in terms when you signed in. I'd like to tell you a little bit about the grant and how we're able to bring speakers in as part of the symposium series. This grant is actually funded by the Department of Homeland Security, the Office of Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention. And so it's a 2-year grant that we've had. It has 10 activities within the grant that we're trying to do. And one of the activities is the symposium series. And the symposium series is what I told DHS would do. We'd offer a symposium of what we think it's relevant to our practitioners. And we were going to offer those about once a quarter. Is what we aim to do. So you'll see in the packet, you'll see a flyer for the next one, which is on April 1st, and that's the idea of looking at mass shootings. And we have a scholar that's coming in from Florida State that actually will present that. So it's part of this bigger grant. You saw the logo on there. This is the REACH program, and part of the REACH program is the umbrella we're using for all the activities under this grant. On that. Part of the packet though, that we've included, you'll see tons of stuff in there. Some is the slide deck, right, that our presenters will be using. That's going to be on the right-hand side. On the left-hand side, you'll see different things from our flyer for the next symposium, the barcode. And one of the things that DHS has asked us to do is, look, we're going to fund you to do these. That's why there's no cost, right, for attendance on that. And the only thing that they ask us to do is to distribute and pick up these surveys. Right, it's a pretty short survey on that, pretty non-intrusive to get your thoughts on the survey, and then we report those back through our quarterly reporting to DHS on that. So those surveys become really important to us on that, because that is in essence one of the measuring sticks that the grant office holds and says, hey, is it relevant? Is it knowledgeable? That they enjoy the event, things of that nature. So at the end of the symposium, I'll have 2 of the students that you met, Gabby and Carolina, out. They'll be collecting the surveys. If you could it takes about a minute or 2. If you fill those out, we would sincerely appreciate that. So this is the flyer for the next one. We've tried to make it easier to register on that, so we use a QR code. And if that becomes an interest, obviously, we encourage you to sign up for the next one, or provide that to some of your colleagues that you might think that might be interested. So we have a mailing list that we try to get this out as broad as we can, to be able to attract that attention. That's something that's relevant. And so if you pass that on, we'd be very interested in that, very, very grateful. There's one more thing I wanted to bring up about the survey. It's the backside on that. There's a question. It's question 4. Is there any other topics that you'd like to hear about on that? That becomes important for this grant, because for this grant, after this symposium, is that we'll be setting up our first meeting with an advisory board that I put together. The advisory board will consist of various folks within our community, some law enforcement, some not in law enforcement, some with the school districts. I've been trying to involve some of the school districts. And then I'd like to be able to come back and say, the folks that you sent to these symposiums are really interested in these topics. And what I'm trying to do is garner their support to say, you know what, if you have a symposium on that topic, we'll support you by allowing our men and women to attendees on that, so that becomes critical to what we're trying to do. Now, before we'll bring our speakers up there, I'd like to tell you a little bit about our speakers. The first one will be up is Dr. Stephen Chermak from the Michigan State University, the School of Criminal Justice. He'll be our first presenter. And his focus is really in the areas of terrorism, looking at ideologically motivated cybercrimes, and school shootings and mass shootings. And you'll see that what's interesting about both of our speakers, between Dr. Chermak and Dr. Scrivens, is that they're not what I would consider your typical academic, right? On that is that their research is based on working with practitioners, right? People like you, on that, to try to make that work relevant to not only what they do, but relevant to what you do. On that deliverable when they're working for agencies on that, to have an impact on that, and it's actually really nice to see. And our second speaker is Dr. Ryan Scrivens. He's an assistant professor as well, he's from Michigan State as well, University, and he's also the associate director for the International Cybercrime Research Center at the Simon Fraser University in Canada. And many of his engagements, a lot of his researchers is actually working with frontline practitioners. And so you'll see their contact info. You'll see during the course of the presentations, things will come up that you'll want to ask. There's also a Q&A period at the end to be able to ask some questions. The break on purpose between speakers was a little bit longer than normal, with the idea that if you had specific questions you want to ask them, exchange contact information, I will definitely encourage that. I will tell you that when we have these symposiums, oftentimes it's like a class, to be honest with you, on campus. Everyone sits to the back. Everyone sits in their groups, right? El Paso PD, all of them, right? Right? And then we've got the Texas Rangers a little bit, right? Or the state, and then you have Border Patrol, CBP, and you come up, we all sit in different groups, just like we do in a class. And then we all sit in the back, and no one likes to ask questions, right? On that. And so that's why the break's a little bit longer. They'll be able to have those conversations on that. Because believe me, I'm hoping that you look and say, man, we didn't think of this. Or this would be very helpful for what we do. But they also got a ton of value from their interactions with you on that, where this, man, that's a perspective we didn't consider, something that might be interesting on that. So I encourage you to do that. And so with that, I would like to invite Dr. Stephen Chermak up to the podium, and thank you, sir.
Good morning, everyone. Just want to start first to thank Vic for the invitation and coordinating this, and he's been great to work with, and really came and told us to talk about what sorts of things we're working on now, and generate some ideas and discussion. And like he just said, both Ryan and I are really interested in what you think and what we're missing, and whether or not it's helpful. Because it sort of translates back into how we sort of approach our work, as well as how we present our work. I'd also want to just thank, before I get started, all of you for taking time to join us today. I know how busy you are. I know the 1,000 of things that are on your schedule, and all the work that you do, the important work that you do. And so to take time and a good part of your morning to come here, I really appreciate that. And so I hope, both Ryan and I hope that we make it worth your time. We're doing it in two short sessions, and Ryan and I collaborate a lot on different issues, and And during the questions and answers, he'll jump up and may say, hey, have some input, and I might do the same. But I'm going to focus first this morning on just sort of the offline behavior of domestic extremists in the U.S., talk about a variety of different issues, and then in the second session, we'll focus more on sort of some of the online activities of extremists in the U.S. Just in terms of this session, I'm going to focus a little bit talking about briefly about sort of researching terrorism and what that means in the U.S. and how that's changed. I'm going to talk about the extremist crime database, which is what I use and created to sort of think about these issues about domestic extremists in the U.S. And then we'll talk about 3 specific issues. I want to talk a little bit about the criminal activities of far right, far left, and Islamic extremists in the U.S. I'm going to talk a little bit about lone actor terrorism and the severity of their attacks. And then I'd like to conclude with talking about some of the strategies that are used effectively to fail and prevent terrorism and what's worked over time. So I thought it's probably best to start here. It was just over about 20 years ago when Al-Qaeda committed one of the most devastating acts of transnational terrorism in the U.S., targeting iconic symbols of U.S. government and leading to the death of 3,000 people. We talk about a lot of different impacts of that particular day, but importantly, the September 11th attacks essentially reshaped how scholars, how academics invested in the study of transnational terrorism. And I just wanted to demonstrate it with this. So there's been now, since 20 years has passed, academics like to retrospectively look at things and do a review of everything that's been done on terrorism. And you can see the impact on both the quality and breadth of what we know about terrorism because of that. That is, just within the last 20 years, the entire body of research on terrorism has been published. 90% of the body of research on terrorism has essentially been published in the last 20 years. There's still about 3 or 4 books written come out every day about the topic. And there's been over 7,000 scholarly articles published just in the last 20 years. And what the research shows is that it's not slowing down, and just the opposite, that it's sustained, but it's also in many ways accelerating. And the breadth part is also pretty interesting because no longer is the study of terrorism discipline specific. That is, back in the 90s when I was studying paramilitary survivalists, militia groups, and what they were doing, most of my outlets for my work were in terrorism journals and some criminology journals. But now what we see is terrorism-related articles appearing in economics journals, in law, arts, and humanities journals, in computer science, in medicine, and other things. And this last issue about the impact of terrorism journals, which is a good thing, is that their impact has decreased. That is, that's not the only place where people are going to understand terrorism. That is, they're publishing things in a variety of different disciplines. It's opening up a much broader discussion about what's happening and what terrorists do and what we can do about it. I just want to talk a little bit about why that is, and primarily the issue becomes down to funding. That, again, after the 9/11 attacks, there was an extraordinary amount of research funding that became available through the Department of Homeland Security as well as other government agencies. But the other thing is we figured out a way to study terrorism that was unique, and that is by using essentially open source information to build a database to start asking questions about things we don't know about terrorism yet. That is something that was sort of rarely used in criminology and criminal justice, has really become the mainstay of how we study terrorism today. And so that's essentially using publicly available, accessible information, and we reconstitute it into event-level characteristics, perpetrator, target, and victim characteristics, group characteristics to tell a story about what we're learning about what's going on with terrorism and extremists in the U.S. and other places. And so some examples include the Extremist Crime Database, which I'm going to be talking about, the Extremist Cybercrime Database with Dr. Scrivens will talk just briefly about. You may have heard of the Global Terrorism Database, and there's several others out there all using sort of this strategy. And so as well as it impacting sort of how law enforcement and intelligence analysts sort of relying on public source information, researchers are increasingly doing it and using it. And so not only in the terrorism area, but we see that study other rare events like mass shootings and school shootings, among other things, to use these tactics to study these unique events. So I'm just going to talk briefly. I really want to get to the content, but I want to just give you a little bit more background. So if you have questions, but in terms of what is the Extremist Crime Database, we've gotten funding since about 2008 to build what is a national database, an open source database that tries to capture the criminal activities of political extremists in the United States. And so we include events since 1990 up to almost real time, up through 2020 are cleaned and sort of in the database. We're in the process of cleaning 2021 cases currently, and we'll continue moving forward in terms of building out the database. In terms of the types of events that get into the database, obviously violence with homicides, with a heavy emphasis on homicides. Our funding started and sort of just incrementally grew. So we started with simply including far-right homicides back in 2008, and then over time we've received a variety of other sources of funding to sort of build from there. So it not only includes homicides, but we include bombings and arsons, failed and foiled plots, which I'll talk some about later in the presentation. And it's also, the ECDB is unique, is that we include financial crimes committed by extremists as well as material support, and we try to link some of that financial activities both from an organizational and individual level in terms of how it impacts the violence that may be caused by extremists. And then again, we've expanded to include both far-right extremists, far-left, as well as Al-Qaeda and associated movements are all included within the database. So in order to get in the database, we have two inclusion criteria. One's a behavioral criteria and the other is attitudinal. So for us, it has to be a crime that actually occurred. It has to be something more than hearsay, and it had to occur within the United States after 1990, and we had to identify it in some open source. And then the attitudinal criteria is important. That is, we have specific definitions of what is a far-right extremist, what is a far-left extremist, what is an Al-Qaeda, and sort of these criteria have to be met for it to be included. And then I raised this last issue about ideological versus non-ideological motivation because it's a really important and interesting part of the types of data that we have. That is, oftentimes, right, we want to establish motive. We want to establish whether or not their extremist ideology played a role in the actions that they did. And so oftentimes what we would see is that somebody may be a white supremacist, they might be a sovereign citizen, but they may commit a non-ideological murder. In a domestic violence situation, they may kill their partner or something along those lines. We didn't want to lose that data, right? That the fact that we wanted to know that they were violent, but they were committing non-ideological events. So we also include non-ideological acts in the database. But if a sovereign citizen murders a police officer at a traffic stop, we'd call that an ideological event because their extremism is driving that violence. And so what we're able to do then is compare either non-ideological events to the ideological events, how they're similar and how they're different, but it also gives us a better snapshot of just how violent the extremists are and whether or not they're involved in regular criminal activities and how they're involved in whether or not they're involved in crimes for profit, because we often see extremists involved in the drug trade and other types of crimes, and how that translates into their ideological crimes as well. So again, I'll go through quickly in terms of the process we go through, but just so you can get a sense and question, whether or not it's, sort of the quality of the information. But, our effort is to first go out and find events involving extremists and where they occurred. And so we comb through existing databases. We comb through government reports, obviously media, watch group reports, and other things. And sort of in a snowball way, we try to identify every single event that meets our criteria that happens within the United States. And then we try to verify them to include in the database. And then once we find an event and that it occurs, then we start building out the information. And so essentially what we do then is treat an event like a case study, and we collect everything we possibly can find about that particular event. Our open source strategy is a lot different than other databases. That is, we collect everything that we can find. We go through every search engine. Even though we get duplicated records, we include those duplicated records in our case file about that particular case. We don't stop. Many open source databases take 2 or 3 documents and they're happy with that, and that they think that encompasses, sort of an understanding of the event. We include everything that we can find. So we go through as many search sites as social media sites, Department of Corrections, whatever we can get through, personal histories off social media, and we include all that information into a file that we essentially use to find data about the event. And so you can see the types of things, again, because of the internet, we're able to do this type of work, and we've been actually extraordinarily surprised at the amount of information we can comb and just pull from publicly available sources, court documents, police documents, but also all this other information from social media and blogs, op-eds, opinion pieces, movement materials, as well as a lot of media documents about these cases. They tend to get publicity, especially the most violent cases, and they can tend to get coverage. We do have some struggles that we have to maintain, because you would imagine that these events have variations in the amount and type of information that we have, right? So you can think of an event like Timothy McVeigh committing the Oklahoma City bombing. We literally have millions of pages of publicly available information about that event. Scholarly books written about it, journalistic books written about it. We have a really good sense of his entire life course in terms of where he was involved, what were his connections. All that information is available, but then we have all these other events in the database that simply don't have that level of attention or that level of coverage. We may have a dozen articles. We may have 2 dozen articles. So one of the things we do, which is a real important thing, is we keep count of the number of documents we have per case, as well as the type of documents per case, so that when we make some argument about this is what's occurring in the far right, or this is what's occurring in the far left, we can sort of look at it as the whole in terms of every individual far leftist in our database, but then we can also pull out the cases where we have what we would call the best information, or the most amount of information about it, to see whether or not what we think we're seeing happening actually holds for the best available data. So you can see we track the number and type of documents we have per case. So essentially what we do is then take that big case file of all that information, and we try to sort of put it into categories. Perpetrator characteristics, victim characteristics, group characteristics, incident characteristics, as well as the quality of information. And this is one of those things where we assign it to a more senior coder, and we instruct them to say, okay, you now have a good sense of what went on in this particular case. Do some targeted searches to see more about the geographic place, the target where the particular event occurred. Or here's some additional witnesses or individuals, victims, perpetrators who are involved. Conduct an independent search to see if you can find out anything more about the event. That's added to the file, and all of that influences essentially our coding decisions. Look, you probably have concerns about it. We do too. We sort of struggle with this. We sort of built the database in terms of there's methodological challenges to make sure that the data is right. There's definitional issues, analysis problems, as well as sort of operational, just kind of maintaining it is, to simply search a case on average, one single case, is about a 8 to 12 hour commitment by one of our researchers, which is just a long time. And that's just to get the data, and then to make sense of the data, and it adds that many hours. So per one case to get into our database, it's about, on average, about 25 hours of work, all right, in order to do it. So please feel free to ask questions and have concerns about the database, because we sort of learned and we've sort of tried to address a lot of the things over time simply because of feedback from people like you. All right, so let me just talk about some of the things we know based on the data. So I want to talk just generally about the threat of terrorism in the U.S., or the threat of violent extremists in the U.S. So domestic attacks in the U.S. outnumber international attacks, 7-1 in the United States. And also this is a growing threat. That is of an increased concern that domestic extremists are a significantly greater threat compared to external international terrorist groups. In terms of what we know, sort of even taking the ECDB and working backwards, you think about far-right extremists in the U.S., it's been a stable threat for a long time, but you can see that threat through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and currently, and it's probably a top priority concern within the U.S. in terms of it's the most stable threat over time. In terms of jihadists, you really don't have much activity prior to 1990. That level of activity increased significantly after that particular point, sort of ending up with the 9/11 attacks in 2001. As you know, Al-Qaeda became a focus of international law. Go ahead.
Just curious, Beirut, 80s, since it was an attack on Americans, would you include that, or would it just be domestic?
It's great. Yeah, it's a great question, and that would be considered international terrorism because of where it occurred. So in terms of where we put it, we would put it not as a domestic, but as international. Okay. But important, though, also in terms of thinking about it, because this point about jihadists, right? So Al-Qaeda dwindles in power, right? Bin Laden is gone. The organization globally is in disarray, right? I mean, it still has some strongholds in the Middle East, still have the U.S. as a target, and that's sort of an evolving concern. Same thing with like ISIS, right? ISIS losing some power, rising to its peak of power, some dysfunction, but pulling together. And the question is whether or not, and how does that translate to on-soil threat versus an international threat, right? Certainly U.S. targets abroad are one question, and they're significant. We're focused more on domestic targets and when domestics are targeted. This issue of homegrown radicalization is significant because of the internet and because of some of the issues that Dr. Scrivens will talk about, is that moving people towards violence, moving individuals to one, recruit, but then to adopt a radicalized version of extremism, and then moving them to violence is a significant concern, because the groups that we can talk about from the Islamic extremists to the far right and far left all see it as an opportunity to say, who could I get to do my dirty work, right? Can we push people to be more radicalized and move them to action without at risk for us? And those threats are real. The far left is really interesting because as of right now, not many people are talking about the far left. In the 60s and 70s, we talked a lot about them, the Weatherman, the Black Panther Party. We talked about the left with the Animal Liberation Front, the Earth Liberation Front in the 90s, early 2000s. We don't talk about them much anymore. But the far left is certainly what we've seen, at least in the last 4 or 5 years, a growing concern in terms of violence. For certain, attacks on police officers, case out of Denver, where by an Occupy Denver leader killing a police officer, the attacks on 5 police officers in Dallas by, I guess best we can call him a wannabe black nationalist, at that time. But those violent attacks by far leftists are certainly on the increase, but they're not nearly as talked about as others.
On your far left,
Yeah.
do you get pushback? Because I noticed you don't have like BLM or Antifa or anything on there. Do you have a lot of problems including that in your type of research?
Yeah, no, this is a great question. Again, in terms of our own funding, so again, DHS provided funding for the ECDB to study Animal Liberation Front and Earth Liberation Front only. So we had funding to do that. We knew that the far left more generally was a concern. So independently, we've been looking and trying to gather some of the other data. So in terms of, there is some pushback. So the far left is narrower than it should be. And those are certainly other concerns that, sort of, we're trying to get funding to sort of build those out as well, if that makes sense.
Those are probably the biggest threat to all of us in here.
In terms of that, yeah, I can see that. And I'll talk about some of that in terms of the amount of violence, in terms of giving some perspective on that. In terms of far right, so talk about a couple of things. So there is considerable empirical as well as anecdotal support that the far right poses a significant threat to public safety in the U.S. At least overall, they account for the majority of violent attacks in the U.S. And the threat concern has grown significantly in the last 6 years. We can talk about some of the, how that's evolved over the last 6 years, if you'd like. And it's likely, at least most accounts talk about it increasing. That is, there's usually some signature event that rallies people around. So we go back to Charlottesville. The Unite the Right rally brought a lot of far-right rhetoric and far-right extremism all together. And then, because of what occurred, there was a backlash and sort of and causes some dysfunction as well as destabilization of the movement. And so things slow down. Obviously, this again peaked because of political rhetoric, because of media rhetoric. It sort of peaked again at the insurrection on January 6th. Again, there's this sort of, we're in this, I think, period of destabilization where groups are disrupted because of either being arrested because they're involved in insurrection or investigations and everything else. But you would expect that over time there's, again, that stabilization point and then movement back to violence, you would think. And then far right, again, poses significant, their primary motivators, obviously anti-government concerns going back to Timothy McVeigh and Timothy McVeigh's concerns. But the attacks on law enforcement, again, this is an issue that's not studied enough because most of the research on looking at violence against law enforcement is looking at murders of police officers. And far rightists account for a good portion of that, and we see increases. But the other types of things that aren't being studied are simply attacks and threats against families and everything in terms of whether or not nobody's really asked that question. I think it's an important issue that we're neglecting. And obviously also racially motivated attacks as well. So just in terms of a comparative sense, in terms of thinking about threats and the nature of threats, we've done a number of surveys, and others have as well, in terms of thinking about what is law enforcement primarily concerned about. And over time, it kind of ebbs and flows, but the primary concerns has been, in general, far right and Islamic threats. Obviously after 9/11, everybody talked about it as a primary threat. More people now, law enforcement sort of highlighting across the U.S. are sort of highlighting concerns about far right and far right activities. And so this is what we mean by changes at time. And there's also geographic variations as well, as this was just was pointed out in terms of the issue that you raised. But this is the interesting point about this, right? Jihadists commit fewer offenses. Just since 1990, we have 50 ideologically motivated homicide incidents within the U.S., taking just over 3,000 lives. In comparison, right, the far right has more events, 215, but only accounting for significantly fewer lives, 450 lives. So essentially, media love asking this question, who's the greatest threats? It's a hollow question. It doesn't really do us any good. But, it depends on how you look at it. But jihadists commit fewer events, but they try for mass casualty. They try to get more bodies, and it's the nature of the types of crimes that they do. Extremist far rights commit more, but it's much more likely for an extremist far rightist to focus on a particular target, a specific individual, a mosque, a church, whatever it might be, whereas jihadists are much more likely to pick a public space and look for more events. Now, what's interesting, again, we made this point about the far left, which is interesting. So what's not on here, so since 1990, about 50, the far left's committed about 56 homicides during that same period of time. So it's similar to jihadists in terms of the numbers, but again, far leftists are more like far rightists in terms of picking specific targets, not general targets. This is probably too small to see, so I apologize. I realized that, as I was looking at it, I'm like squinting in my hotel room, and it's like, I can barely read it, so I'm sure you can't. But just pay attention. Again, this was the far right versus far left. And so the orange line, the on top line is the far right violence, is the number of incidents, so essentially on your left, and then the number of victims on your right. So the orange line is the far right, and the blue line is the far left. And I just wanted to put this up there again to show you there's some ebb and flow in terms of, sort of each year, how many events that we talk about, as well as victims. But in general, the far right accounts for a higher number of events. But then again, that last 5 years is interesting, simply because of the spike on the far left side in terms of the number of, these are just homicides from our data, those types of attacks. And shift gears just a little bit, but sort of build on this and talk about lone actor attacks in the U.S. It's a concern in this area, in this space, because counterterrorism officials, law enforcement really are concerned about the potential for lone terrorism and additional threats to national severity. There's different investigatory challenges. When I start talking about how plots have been foiled, in terms of responding to extremists, what you'll see is that confidential informants, undercover operatives are critical for investigating domestic extremists in the U.S. And really accounts for the vast majority of events being stopped, right? Well, this poses a unique challenge when you involve a loner, because it's harder to infiltrate. You don't have a group situation. You don't have a way to connect with an individual in order to monitor. And so it poses some really difficult challenges from a law enforcement perspective. There is concern that this is increasing, that lone attacks in the U.S. are on the uprise, and that it's unique, that lone terrorism is disproportionately committed in the U.S. Compared to other countries. So I'll just walk you through this in terms of how we think about the different individuals and their affiliations. And so when we talk about loners, we're talking about individuals who operate by themselves. If you could imagine them simply being radicalized in front of their computer at home and then carrying out some event. We often think about this like mass shooters, right? Is that there's not much connection. They don't have many social bonds across in a variety of different ways. And so they're not part of a group, they're not affiliated with a group, but they're ideologically similar to people who are active in the movement. They're different than lone wolves, who are part of sort of an informal group or a formal far-right group in some way, but they operate without the directive of that group in committing some violent crime. And then wolf packs, that last category, is a combination of somebody who's involved in a group, and the group does collectively comes to the decision to do violence. And we just wanted to present, I wanted to just present that to just show that what we see is that they're different. Those different categories produce differences in who and what to expect. So loners, people who do it completely independent of others, tend to be a little bit older than the other types of perpetrators. Now this is the probably the finding that's most interesting. That is, they're significantly more likely to have mental illness, some evidence of mental illness relative to the other groups. That is, loners have, 4 out of 10 loners have some, and this is documented case of mental illness. So oftentimes with mass shooters and or loners, oftentimes the media, when they report out on it, will often make reference to some mental issue and raise it. We work to verify that, make sure that there has some documented psychological indication before we actually say they have a mental illness. But the findings are pretty stark, right? 4 in 10 compared to the other categories in terms of having some evidence of mental illness. They're much more likely, loners are much more likely to focus on a specific issue, not be driven by overall far-right ideology, but usually with the far right, it's driven by abortion-related concerns. More likely to be anti-government compared to the other groups. And then just running through the other categories, I just wanted to raise like the mental illness category for the group that kind of is part of a group but decides to go off on their own to do violence. They're somewhere in between loners and group level violence. And then probably the interesting thing here has to do with skinheads / neo-Nazis, right? Because only about 17% of the loners were affiliated with a skinhead group and or a neo-Nazi group, whereas 40% of these wolf pack offenders, somebody who is part of a group but decides to go off on their own, and then the bigger, almost 60% of those affiliated with the group where there's a group level event are affiliated with neo-Nazi skinhead groups. I'm just going to run through this, and that's the 58%. This next slide just shows, I just want to point out 2 things. First, in terms of the weapon use, loners are significantly more likely to use firearms relative to the other lone wolf group, as well as the group affiliated, the wolf pack group. 8 out of 10 of loners will use a firearm. And then this is, again, another interesting finding is that loners produce more casualties, all right? At least it seems like they're somewhat more severe than the other groups. That is, their numbers are a little bit higher. So 2 out of 10 produce multiple victims as opposed to the other groups. And then you can just see the sort of declining influence of firearms in the lone wolf area, as well as declining interest in the multiple victim deaths. And then knives in this group. Again, remember this goes back, our data goes back to 1990, so this is a lot of the skinheads, a lot of hand-to-hand, a lot of blunt instruments, a lot of knives being used to commit homicide, especially in the early 90s. So, but this is really the multiple victim thing kind of raised this sort of issue is whether or not lone actors are actually more severe. This is sort of, it seems like they are, but we decided to do some additional analysis to see whether or not lone actors perpetrate more severe attacks than others. And so, again, we take the data that we have from the Extremist crime database, and we took 230 events out of the database, and then we take those events where we have at least 1 fatality. And then the question we look at is whether or not loners essentially produce more fatalities, that is just homicides, or casualties, which is deaths plus injuries. So 2 different dependent variables. And so, again, it's the same sort of categorization. We just sort of built it out to sort of account for the different types of groups you'll find. Informal groups are more loosely connected. We see this a lot with gangs, where you have a specific gang, formal organizational structure, but then more likely you're going to have just a group of X number of individuals sort of around a particular area and sort of all bound together informally. We see that same thing with extremists a lot, where they're bound together through friendship, through family, through other things. They sort of call themselves something, but they're just more structured around. They share an ideology, they share concerns, and they share activities, criminal and other types of activities. But again, not going to talk about the analysis too much, but you can ask questions if you'd like. Just a big word, negative binomial regression, you know. Academics like to throw that stuff out like it means something. And then I ran 8 different models just to sort of, with 4 on each of the dependent variables, 1 with fatalities, 1 with casualties, so 4 each. But then because of the 9/11 and the Oklahoma City bombing having so many victims, it sort of disproportionately affects what we're seeing. And so I wanted to make sure that what we're seeing by removing them from the analysis, that in general, what's happening in terms of lone wolf attacks. And then just kind of controlling for other things that might account for differences, like characteristics like the firearm usage, as well as ideology and ideological strength, among other things. But again, the short of it, and I don't want to spend much time of it, is there's some support, but not strong support, that loners are more severe. If I just use the fatalities variable, the results are limited support. You'll see, you know, as long as you sort of get rid of the 9/11 events, you'll see that loners are a little bit more likely to be severe in terms of fatalities. But when we include injuries as well, loners tend to be, there's much stronger support for the notion that loners are different and they're more likely to commit severe attacks. Some of that is because of the weapon type, and some of it is it's less likely to be choose specific targets, right? Loners are more likely to like a mass shooter, pick a location and open fire. So X number of people will be killed, more injuries occurring because they're not looking specifically, targeting specific individuals. All right. The last issue I want to talk about before I take your questions is this question of successful and unsuccessful attacks in the United States. Most of terrorism research looks at a completed event, an act of terrorism, and then tries to make sense of it, which makes a lot of sense. But, you know, I always think back to when I did some homicide research with the Indianapolis Police Department and worked with homicide detectives. You know, and we tried to help them understand what's going on with homicide. And there was a great detective, you know, 35 years in, worked homicide a long time, and he said, you know, son, the only thing, the difference between a homicide and an attempted homicide is oftentimes a half inch, you know, in terms of where it is. So why aren't you doing the attempts? Because the attempts tell just as important as the story about what's going on with homicide in this community as homicide. And that point resonates because it's the same thing with terrorism. Everybody who studies terrorism looks at the terrorism act completed, not thinking about the almosts, right? This could have been. And that could have been is really, really important to understanding what's going on. And so that's what we do here. And so essentially what this line of research has done is we think about terrorism in the United States, and then we look at successful attacks from a terrorist perspective, and those end up being our homicides, right? And then we think about unsuccessful attacks. And we make these as foiled and failed plots, all right? Just to make things a little bit more, I guess, easy to think about it, we sort of create these 2 categories. Category 1 is where an individual, a group, has a specific target, right? And so they say, we're going to bomb the Brooklyn Bridge, or we're going to bomb this particular place. And those are category 1s. When we talk about category 2, it's much more general, all right? It's a group that's rallying around, well, we want to kill Jews as part of it, but not really specific. There's not really a plan in place to do that, but they're talking about it, and they're still moving towards that. So we sort of break those plots up in those 2 different categories. It helps us think about the implications from a law enforcement perspective. So just in terms of what, I wanted to show just a couple of things in terms of the homicide incidents or plots and the perpetrators. And so you can see much more likely that we're looking at plots with specific targets, which I think means that they're more meaningful. That is, they're moving to a specific place. They're planning around a particular location, particular individual, particular geographic, whatever it might be, a particular critical infrastructure, they're moving towards that particular point to commit the crime. And then you can see, I thought this was interesting because the next slide is really powerful, in that you see the number of Al-Qaeda, I just pulled the Al-Qaeda homicide events in the US from 1990, and obviously there's a spike corresponding to the 9/11 attacks. And all of you know what happened to law enforcement, happened to the intelligence apparatus, and everything that we did after 9/11 to make sure that there's not another 9/11 and what happened. And so probably this is a powerful slide to sort of capture and say, and look, the reason this slide is all the work that you all do and everybody who's in law enforcement, right? Because what this shows is the number of plots that increased in the US. And so you look at this over time, you see the number of failed and foiled plots almost being non-existent prior to 9/11, and then putting an apparatus in place to do something about it. And so these are all potential terrorist attacks that are up here that were stopped. They were foiled because of the activities of law enforcement primarily, as you'll see, in terms of what explains it. And so that increase of those attacks is pretty powerful in my view. And then you can just see, again, I talked about the category 1 and category 2. You know, the vast majority of plots have specific targets. And then you can see in terms of law enforcement, in terms of the number of individuals indicted for those, as well as some geographic focus on both the South and the Northeast. Again, these are where these particular plots were focused, what critical infrastructure was targeted. From military, about 18% focused on the military, about 15% in politics or government, 13% of business, and then moving it way down. And then again, much more likely to use bombs and explosives. So you can see, going back to where we talked about different types of weapon use, is that you just sort of have somewhat more, significantly more plots involving bombings and explosives and being foiled beforehand. But these are much concerned, right? They're much concerned because of the potential for casualty count, depending on the nature of the explosive. But this is, my last few slides is just a comparison to think about what happens to stop an event from occurring. So investigations, what our research shows that how law enforcement investigates far-right terrorist enterprises has remained pretty stable, relatively stable over time. And unsurprisingly, I think, our results suggest that investigations into jihadi terrorist activities were significantly more likely to occur after 9/11 attacks. That one slide I just showed kind of emphasized that, as over, close to 96% of the jihadi threats that have been thwarted have happened after 2001, after the 9/11 attacks, whereas about half of prevented far-right terrorist attacks occurred since 2001. The research shows that how a particular investigation was initiated was quite different. We find that tips from the public are proportionately more likely to launch investigations into far-right activities compared to jihadist crimes. That is, the evidence suggests that information from the public preempted about 71% of the far-right plots in our study, compared to about 36 of the plots, jihadi plots in the data. And jihadi investigations are proportionately more likely to originate from other unrelated criminal cases. Again, we talked about the non-ideological nature of many crimes, their involvement in financial crimes, as well as other things, as providing a lead towards a potential violent plot that was occurred. That is, nearly 47% of jihadi investigations stem from law enforcement investigations into unrelated crimes. Now, again, it's not surprising simply because the nature of terrorist enterprise and extremists. About federal law enforcement, usually the FBI is involved in investigating about 90% of the failed plots, but state and local law enforcement are also involved. They're involved in fewer of the jihadi investigations compared to the far-right terrorist and crimes. Again, there's a transnational sort of, in terms of more movement, far-rightists tend to stay closer to home in terms of where they pick their targets. They're usually more well-known by law enforcement, whereas jihadists tend to move more from a place. They're not nearly as likely to commit crimes close to their residence compared to far-rightists. About 51% of investigations into the jihadi plots have state or local law enforcement, whereas 76% of the far-right do. There's no statistical differences in the use of confidential informants or undercover operatives. That is, federal undercover agents, CIs, usually handled by the FBI, is the most common investigatory practice. That's not surprising to any of you. Across movement types, though. And so it's a tactic that is viewed to work more specifically. 40% of the jihadi investigations rely on federal undercover agents. 37% of the far right involve somebody working undercover within the movements. And then even more investigations involve the use of confidential informants. 53% of investigations in the jihadi crimes and more than 67% of the far right investigations. And much more likely to be used by federal agencies. So before I let you go and ask questions, I have a small request, all right? This plot research is something that there's not enough we know quite yet. There's other questions that we need to know. We're actually moving towards pitching a project to DHS through the Insight Terrorism Center. If any of this work in particular, the plots work, is of interest to you, your agency, if you could just let me know. I don't have to use your name, but DHS really wants to know whether or not this stuff matters to you. I think it does. But if you could let me know, just drop me, let me have your business card or anything else. I'd appreciate it. I'm not holding you to anything. Just that something this resonates with you, and if we can learn more about it in terms of how it impacts you, you'd find it useful. I'd be happy. I'd appreciate that. And with that, I'll take any questions that you have about what I talked about.
Steve, I have a question.
Yeah.
When you first started doing this work, and you've been doing this for some time now, and you started this particular roles and stuff, is there anything in the findings that you found out that really surprised you that you just didn't expect?
Well, I think the far left issue is something we've been struggling with, simply because, again, it's unique because you don't hear it as much. You don't hear about that. I think the attacks on law enforcement, I think it's underplayed in terms of really thinking about what we know and what we can do about that. So I think those two things surprised me, a lot. But I also think about it as sort of overall threats, right? In terms of the numbers here, to me, they're a concern, but at the same time, right, as much as we invest in this question, the overall, in terms of all the things you all have to deal with and all the, crimes, it's, not nearly as big as people think it is, and so the more we can think about, well, if we put resources into the issues more strategically, then I don't know. There's different ways to spread out those resources, I think. So I think those are probably the things that surprised me the most. Sort of the disconnect between how the public thinks about these issues and what the data shows.
If your research has media, like in what you've collected, national media, has that influenced like any of these actors? Because you're constantly bombarded with either far right all the time and far left not so much. So
yeah, that's a great question, and because we don't have a good handle on it, but what we know, like the radicalization in terms of what brings people into this, the rhetoric that occurs, where do they get it from, right? How does somebody get radicalized views, right? And what we do know is that what you read, social media, news media matters in terms of how you think about these issues and how you engage those issues. Now, what moves you to violence, I think is a different story. But all the radicalization literatures out there sort of breaks those things into, okay, how do you get extremist views and how do you adopt extremist views, right? Talk about QAnon and other things. How do you develop those, okay? And that's one issue. To have extremist views, look, U.S., you can have whatever views you want, right? Our concern is when you move and take that to violence and sort of move it. So I think those are two questions: the media content, social media, the discussions that occur, the political rhetoric, how people talk about it, definitely is radicalized, moves people to have radicalized attitudes. I don't know what happens to get them to move to action. That's the one question I think that we haven't done enough to sort of move to. Yeah, good, go ahead.
Question, has there been any studies done between the population that are Marxist as opposed to faith-based, i.e. jihadist, in terms of the execution-wise stuff? Because a hope-based action based on a jihadist, their hope of some 70 virgins or whatever
Yeah.
their version of their heaven is, based on their actions, that's one thing. And Marxism has got an extreme, they'll co-opt almost any movement with the intent of using violence to procure their end game.
Yeah, and that's probably, Vic asked the question about what surprised me is that, the point you raise is a very important one. That is we should think about these three types of groups differently because they're motivated differently and the way they radicalize different. So everything, there's very little research that compares across groups, like in terms of just, we know characteristics, from demographic characteristics in terms of background, they're very different, right, in terms of where they go. But we treat them all alike. And we treat them all alike in terms of policy, in terms of how we respond to them. But I think you're right. I think there's thinking about how they get to the same place. I want to commit an extremist violent act, but through different pathways. And we don't have enough to really understand those pathways, those different pathways. We talk about some of the same issues in terms of the importance of bonds. We have, in terms of how you learn and some of the other issues, but not how there's difference across movement type. So it's a great question, really, a research question. Go ahead.
I have a question. I'm not sure if you'd be able to answer it. So I know you guys do a lot of studies on events that have happened in the past. What about what's happening now with the amount of people from Afghan that got released, the amount of people from Turkey, and how we don't have the proper databases to fully run these individuals to actually know if they were the right person, that's coming over. Are there any studies on how that's going to impact society moving forward?
Yeah, that's a great question and a great challenge. Because even, we do a lot of work, in other countries are sort of kind of struggling with those same sorts of issues, and so whether or not there's predictive power, we're retrospective, right? So we're looking backwards, right? And trying to tell a story, hoping that analysts can think about it and say, okay, well, can this lead me in a direction? But it's not doing what you need it to do, is right, and how do we actually get to a point to sort of understand what's going on in real time and impacting these movements? Because you certainly think, and we've seen this, right? People who've studied the radicalization that occurred in Somali communities in Minnesota in terms of how that happened, in terms of bringing people together, how a small number of influencers tried to influence a large number of people in the communities, and then what the community did to stop it, right? But that was just on the ground, boots on the ground sort of reaction to that in order to respond to it. But you're right, this data doesn't help you on that question at all, really. But it's really important.
Yeah, because in all reality, we don't even know who really got let in.
Absolutely.
They really say who they are, but is that going to affect us later on? Is there any studies in the process, or is it just nobody sees nothing?
Yeah, we talk about this. It's interesting in terms of the balancing about threat versus rights, right? And so people can organize, and people can have whether you have far right views, far left, you can protest and you can do all that, and as you all know, you can't do anything about it until there's some criminal nexus, you know, in order to actually do that work. When thankfully we can look back on it, but what's happening in those meetings and everything else ties to that violent action. But until that violent action occurs, you know, it's hands off. You know, it's hands off, and so we have to wait for an act to register. And it's some countries don't have the same kind of delays, you know, in terms of doing it. And so you look at like how Israel responds to terrorism, and how it's different in terms of how they monitor it. You know, it's quite different simply because of that. Other questions? Like, I need to use the bathroom. I need coffee. I understand.
Steve, thank you very much.
Yeah, sure.
There's a couple points made in some of those questions that I'd like to kind of go back and reiterate to give you an idea of what the realm of possibility is. Right, the last question you had asked about what's being done now, when you talk about the things like Operation Ally Freedom, right, or Welcome or something like that, that it comes back and be able to go on Fort Bliss, watch that myself, looking at those things, is you start to ask the questions. Who are they? What are they doing? What do we know about them on that? The beauty, though, is I will tell you that at least through DHS, is I'm starting to see research opportunities to be able to identify those risks and vulnerabilities on that. So our center here at UTEP, we're interested in looking at those type of things. Many of you know I spent most of my adult life within the Department of Homeland Security, and so my interest is what is it that we can do to look at in terms of the law enforcement aspect, right? And it's really about risk and vulnerabilities. And so we all know, you all know there's risks and vulnerabilities on that. Unfortunately, you need someone from the outside to tell someone else in the inside on that. So there's things that we're working on that as well. Steve talked about contacts and things that I would encourage you to do that, because I will tell you, at least most of our grants are through the Department of Homeland Security or Department of State. And one of the questions they always ask is, hey, you want to do research, but who cares? Who's it relevant to? And if they're able to point down some agencies, hey, we think these agencies would be, it's relevant, they care on that, and what they do at a very high level, agencies, and say, hey, if we were to fund this grant, would you find use in it? And it's usually a simple letter say, yeah, we find a lot of use on that. We're not making a commitment, but we'd find a lot of use if that were to happen. That becomes very powerful in terms of the work that they're trying to do on that. So we're going to go on a break, about a 20-minute break, give you an opportunity, bio break, coffee, things of that nature. Speak to Steve if you'd like. I know there are some multiple questions that were asked, and I'm going to actually reach out to the folks that I know that ask questions, because I do have something for them. What I do is folks that ask questions, I give them a UTEP challenge coin on that. So you know that now. So when Ryan comes up on that, he's probably going to get bombarded with questions on the deal.
Just don't throw chips at me, please.
So I'll have I'll reach out to those folks. If I missed you and said I asked a question, let me know, and I'll get you the coins on the deal. But if we could reconvene at 10:35. Thank you. Well, we're going to go ahead and start the section 2 of the symposium. Get 'em done. So as I stated at the beginning of the symposium, we have 2 speakers. First speaker was Dr. Steve Chermak and from Michigan State University. Our second speaker is Dr. Ryan Scrivens, also from Michigan State University. And the beauty of both from the same university colleagues is that they've done similar work that interrelates and collaborates on that. And so they teamed up to say, if you do this section, I'll do this section as kind of the follow-on to be able to put that together. And so it'll be kind of the same setup. Dr. Scrivens will be talking about his portion. Again, I encourage the ability to ask those questions during and afterwards on that. And with that, Dr. Scrivens, thank you.
Thanks everybody for being here today. I must admit, I'm not going to have the same organized presentation as Dr. Chermak has. And I was teasing Steve on the car ride here saying I definitely have the more difficult presentation because what I'm presenting really is research largely on the role of the internet in facilitating violent extremism and terrorism. Just very briefly, my background is in online extremism, online terrorism, with an emphasis on right-wing extremism as well. I've done extensive interviews with law enforcement officials, community activists, current and former right-wing extremists on pathways in and out of violent extremism, the role of the internet in facilitating violent extremism, and ways to think about combating it. But I have a pretty good handle on extremism in general. So as I was putting together this presentation, I was trying to think, well, how am I going to do this? Like, what makes sense? Because we wanted to showcase 2 of our recent projects, one that I'm leading and one that Steve and colleagues at MSU were leading. So I thought, okay, I don't want to completely bore you guys, so I'll start by giving you kind of a quick and dirty overview of what the empirical literature, so oftentimes data-driven systematic research, tells us about the role of the internet in facilitating violent extremism and terrorism. And second, I was like, okay, this will be a good dovetail into our work. One project is looking at cyber attack strategies by far right, far left, and Islamist extremists. And the second one, looking at extremist posting patterns and behaviors. So there's been an influx of research taking shape, as Steve properly mentioned, on violent extremism and terrorism in general, but in particular, their use of the internet and associated technologies. I don't even know where to start with how this has generated so much buzz, but I'll talk about some of the more recent events. The so-called Islamic State, in their heyday, 2013-14, released a series of beheading videos that circulated online. Right-wing extremist Tarrant live-streamed attack on a New Zealand mosque, I believe it was 2 years ago, as well as announced his intentions online and produced a manifesto online. And more recently, we've seen anarchist networks online play a key role in coordinating nationwide anarchist-inspired violent protests offline, largely around the Black Lives Matter protests. Importantly, though, empirical research has found, like the general population, so I think this is a big misconception, that terrorists and violent extremists are tech-oriented and computer-savvy, but I think most of us in the room are to some extent as well. I think there are some exceptions. Some are more tech-savvy than others. I'll talk about it a little bit later. But I don't think they're that unique from the way that we use the internet and our children use the internet, for example. But it should come as no surprise that they have increased their presence, violent extremists and terrorists, when possible, and we can talk about this more later, in a variety of online settings, ranging from websites to web forums, to blogs, to social media outlets, encrypted platforms, applications, channels, so on and so forth. Here, research suggests that terrorists and violent extremists have exploited the internet and associated technologies due to its ease of use. It's quick and it's cheap. It's unregulated, relatively unregulated, depending on where you live, and relatively secure. Understandably, there have been numerous explanations for why and how terrorists and violent extremists use the internet, dating back from when the internet really started to gain a mainstream use, late 90s, early 2000s. But what I argue here, and how I'm going to try and make sense of the empirical trends in the role of the internet in facilitating violent extremism, is through the work by Conway. She developed what many experts believe is the most well-rounded and most established understanding of core uses of terrorist use of the internet and associated technologies. And when we try to make sense of this, it applies quite nicely to the far left, the far right, and Islamists, and perhaps in some cases, single or secular terrorism or extremism. So the core uses very generally are information provision, networking, recruitment, financing, and information gathering. So the first, research has overwhelmingly found that violent extremists and terrorists have been undeniably quick to adopt and adapt and use every emerging online platform at their disposal to spread propaganda and further their movement's objectives, amongst many other things. Research has also been showing us that the advent of the internet and associated technologies has provided violent extremists and terrorists with a medium with which they can disseminate their rhetoric relatively unimpeded. We can talk about these nuances more later, to a larger audience than ever before the internet was a thing, and through any combination of communication outlets, ranging from spreading hate propaganda using extremist websites to cloaked websites or websites that don't look like extremist websites, to sharing disinformation via video communication, to radicalize, mobilize, and strengthen activism, to engaging in cyber fear by uploading manifestos prior to acts of violence. And lastly, to utilize cyberspace as a platform to attack computer systems and spread hate propaganda. Turning now to networking. And it's important to keep in mind that there's a lot of overlap, obviously, between networking and recruitment, but this is just one way to present what the empirical literature tells us about the role of the internet in facilitating violent extremism. But what research shows is that overwhelmingly, violent extremists and terrorists communicate and coordinate through decentralized, all-channel manners online. This allows for linking of subgroups and external organizations from around the world to central online spaces, such as web forums, blogs, and social media sites, quickly and at a low cost. Here, much of the recent focus in the empirical literature has been on examining the link between extremist networking online and their transnational connections, as well as their presence across multiple platforms. Social media companies and law enforcement officials are struggling to kind of play what some call this whack-a-mole game, where people will migrate from platform to platform, or they'll be using multiple platforms. So naturally, research has been moving in this direction. And lastly, this idea around trigger events, some of the work that myself and Steve and others have done, looking at how January 6th, for example, could mobilize extremism online, Trump's election victory, mobilizing online, Black Lives Matter, mobilizing online. Turning 3 to recruitment. So research here has found that to raise awareness and convince individuals to join an extremist movement or group, violent extremists and terrorists use the internet to, 1, increase the possibility of interacting with potential recruits, and 2, research has shown that oftentimes they roam online looking for potential recruits, usually young folks, unfortunately. Research in this space, much of which is typically focused on dedicated extremist sites and web forums, because those are the older spaces and academics tend to work slowly, suggests that extremist recruitment materials include kind of one of two categories. One would be the disturbing text, images, and videos. You can see on the side here the first two are more disturbing than the other one. Some argue that these more kind of over-the-top materials are for the insiders, people who are already in the movement, and it kind of keeps them going. And then we have the more subtle material for outsiders. Some news outlets are questionable at best. They could have extreme right views or extreme left views, but the premise is extremism in some capacity, and this is also used to recruit individuals into violent extremism. But regardless of the recruitment material type, research suggests that violent extremists and terrorists have attempted to recruit via what you guys probably have all seen, and I heard somebody in the audience mentioning this earlier amongst one of their colleagues, eye-catchy and visually appealing content. So this is oftentimes in a multimedia format featuring audio-video files, digital video, interactive chat rooms, bulletin boards, cyber cafes, websites featuring video games, music, tech, dating advice, humor pages, etc., etc., etc. Now, I want to address an elephant in the room. I was trying to think of where I could place this. I've spoken to a couple people about this already. This idea of online radicalization. When we think about radicalization in general, it's a highly contested and contentious term that's obviously received considerable attention in the last 10 or so years. And it's raised a number of theoretical, but perhaps more importantly for the audience today, pragmatic questions, including why do some people transition from a violent ideology, from nonviolent ideology to violent ideology? Importantly, though, pathways of radicalization and associated models are complex. There's no doubt about that. But they have been attributed to several influences ranging from intergroup conflict to religious and political leaders to social networks to family, prison, and something we'll be discussing more after, the internet. Regardless of these kind of complex interactions that occur to push someone from extremist ideology to violent extremism, what's increasingly apparent is that radicalization is multidimensional and cannot be explained via a single factor, whether it's micro, meso, or macro, or a silver bullet explanation. And that obviously makes it a challenge for all the folks in this room, including myself. This is largely because radicalization alone does not necessarily imply action, just as those who act in an extreme manner may not necessarily be radicalized either. And it's just as one example, those who become far-right Christians do not necessarily become radicalized, just as those who engage in fanatical or profound activity may not be radicalized either. Regardless, though, I guess the key takeaway here is that experts generally believe that radicalization is a combination of belief and action. So in other words, like the key component of becoming radicalized is one's willingness to engage in action to maintain a commitment to the cause or the ideology. Radicalization is also theorized as nonlinear process, developing radical views, principles, and ideas, and changing subsequent behavior, whether it's violent or nonviolent, in line with those beliefs. So when we think about the internet now and the role that the internet plays in online radicalization, certainly there's potential for those encountering extremist materials online to be radicalized to violence. What research has shown is that violent radicalization tends to occur gradually. It doesn't have to occur in a linear manner, but it tends to be a gradual process and can begin with the introduction of ideological messages online that are encountered, that then shift them from moderate beliefs to more extreme beliefs. And some work has also shown that repeated exposure to extremist materials online may normalize otherwise fanatical beliefs and lead to unwitting radicalization to violence. But there's a big but here. There's this misconception, and I may be preaching to the choir here, that exposure to extremist content, users, and or networks on the internet automatically results in violent radicalization. It's just not the case. So what I'd argue here is that in understanding the link between violent radicalization and the internet, it's important to note that the internet, or we think about the internet as a facilitative tool that affords greater opportunities for violent radicalization and violent extremism. So some of you are wondering, like, what the hell do you mean by this? Well, breaking down some of the empirical literature on this topic, what it generally suggests that people who become radicalized to violent extremism tend to be first exposed to violent extremist content, networks, individuals, both online and offline. And as I was saying to someone in the audience earlier, it's really, really difficult to disentangle the on and offline worlds. We can get into this more if you'd like after. Some of the research I've done, for example, has shown that exposure to violent extremism mostly commonly occurred after a friend in the offline world who they knew and more importantly trusted, directed them to extremist materials online. So nonetheless, if you're gonna try to take anything away from this, I'll break it down like this, I guess. So my understanding of online radicalization is, so exposure to extremist content online does play a critical role. in sparking people's interest in violent extremist ideologies. However, those susceptible to being recruited into violent extremist groups and movements tend to have a desire to belong to something bigger than themselves, to be part of a collective, for example, which is a key factor that actually sparks that initial interest in violent extremist ideologies. But regardless of however somebody first gets exposed to violent extremist ideologies, groups, movements, so on and so forth, it is the internet that eventually facilitates processes of violent radicalization by essentially enabling people to immerse themselves in extremist content. So together then, what the empirical research, even though it's quite limited, I've been fortunate enough to be working in this empirical side of it. What the research is showing us is that violent radicalization is best conceived as a complex process unfolding both on and offline simultaneously in most cases, I would argue. There's little evidence to suggest that the internet is the sole explanation prompting individuals to decide to engage in violent extremism. Motivation, intent, capacity, and space, amongst other things, must be accounted for. And that's a challenge, I'm sure, for everybody in this room. Okay, now that we've gotten that out of the way, we'll move back to what the empirical research says about the role of the internet in facilitating financing within the terrorism and extremism wheelhouse. So this research space is quite limited, but what it has told us is that due to the immediate interactive and global reach, the internet has greatly increased the potential for violent extremists and terrorists to raise funds for their activities. Of the limited work available, researchers generally suggest that funds are raised via kind of two avenues, the one being merchandise sales via extremist sites. Amazon still has problems with extremist content you can buy on there, as well as donation solicitation. I mean, the convoy generated some funds through crowdfunding, P2P transactions, and cryptocurrencies. But importantly, though, and we don't know a lot about this yet, but what the research has been telling us, I guess I'll say to date, is that such sales and donations made virtually are unlikely to generate a significant amount of funding for groups or movements. They can't generate enough momentum, I would argue, the violent extremist movements online trying to finance. They do, however, enable the spread of their message and serve to keep propaganda available to new recruits, as well as maintain a network of like-minded individuals. So the last one, information gathering. So given that the internet contains an overwhelming amount of information, violent extremists and terrorists, amongst others, that's for sure, can collect intelligence on specific targeting opportunities. They can also learn about anti-terrorism measures. They can share online training materials about how to make homemade bombs, plan assassinations, and how to avoid surveillance, amongst many other things. Notably, the relatively anonymous and private nature of the internet has enabled them to strategize and execute their objective with little risk of being apprehended by law enforcement or perceived legal sanctions. I think that's probably changing, but I think that point still holds true. Regardless, because of the availability of information on the internet, violent extremists and terrorists can open source search for documents for information about potential targets, for example. Anybody really can. Some empirical research, for example, though very limited in the space, has suggested that Google Earth is a useful tool to choose how to plan and how to attack a target. Regardless, and as I've alluded to, very little is empirically known about this, about how violent extremists gather information online. But of the limited work out there, researchers have unpacked how information is gathered via one, information sharing. So it's manuals for making bombs, skilled hackers as well, trying to facilitate discussions online. Some research is starting to emerge on questions around data mining. So information is collected and assembled at scale about specific target opportunities. And there's some work also looking at discussions about targeting critical infrastructure. There are a lot of key gaps in the empirical literature here. The key is to try to find what I think are the most pragmatic and realistic gaps. We know a lot, but we can definitely learn more about radicalization and recruitment on online in general. We don't know a lot about these efforts on fringe or encrypted online platforms for two reasons, I'd argue. One, because they're so new and we just can't work fast enough. But second, it's very difficult to gain access to these moving targets, these different Telegram channels, for example. And second, from a broader scale, in terms of thinking about the role of the internet in facilitating violent extremism around financing and information gathering, we know very little at this point. But more importantly, because these are the two papers I'm going to present on now, very little is known about the extent to which terrorists and violent extremists are using cyberspace as a platform to hack and attack online critical infrastructure, i.e. what some would refer to as cyber terrorism. And the second one, very broadly looking at the link between the on and offline worlds of violent extremists. Yeah, sure.
I have a question. You do this research on all of this, the violent extremism and on online stuff. What is the government doing in your research to take care of this? And I get it, it's, cybercrime or whatever, but what are they doing to stop this? I mean, because we do have a lot of domestic terrorism.
Yeah, I guess it just depends on what element we're talking about here. Unfortunately, I don't know what the government is doing in a lot of capacities.
But in your research, you guys don't research any of that to find out?
I don't focus specifically, at least with my current research program, I'm not focusing on what law enforcement are doing in terms of cyber attacks, for example, or posting behaviors. Perhaps that's something, Steve, was that something you're looking at?
I mean, your point is a good one, is that, we're sort of focusing on what's happening online so that we can feed it to law enforcement to sort of change how they do things.
Yeah.
Getting access, I mean, I think still like DHS is in cyber, like the last, in 2020, DHS's emphasis on cyber terrorism. So as they build capacity, I think there'll be more back and forth, between that. But I guess we haven't really studied per se, in terms of strategies that work. Because I think, like Ryan was saying, it was really a moving target. It's a great question, really, in terms
Well,
of
because,
doing it.
the thing is that it's just so easy to go on the internet and look up anything you want to look up. And who's coming after you? Who's going to be that agency that's going to come after you because you Googled how to build a bomb?
Yeah, I mean, so and it's such a good point. So I do work with law enforcement, and I get wrangled in once in a while to do stuff with big tech. I'll do like an invited talk. I don't want to take their money. But these are some of the issues that they're grappling with, because what they've constantly said to the general public as well as law enforcement researchers, they don't want to be the big brother, right? They don't want to be the ones that are saying what should and should not be online. We're starting to get into blurred territories right now, and something we can talk about a little bit later. But you raise a really good point. So what Steve eloquently put was that the work we're trying to do, especially I guess because it's the work that I'm looking at specifically around posting behaviors, we're trying to develop these kind of baselines and these behaviors online to then give to law enforcement, and they can try to make sense of them. And our door is always open if they want to come chat with us.
It doesn't seem like it's moving fast enough for us.
It's
just a
yes,
constant.
yeah. It's definitely a challenge. Thanks for your question.
Yeah, no, I just would think too that the big question too is the stuff we talked about with failed and foiled plots earlier. In this space, that's a good study, right? Because we want to know what's working, in that space to sort of say, okay, how did you prevent a cyber terrorism attack, and how do you use that? I think those are good questions.
Man, you had a question?
Yeah, Ryan, I had a question. Actually, it's for both of you, though. So when you talk about like social media recruitment, right? And so during attacks on some of the studies that you were looking at, did you guys see a shift or like a dark period where somebody who was online radicalized and then went dark and then a precipitated event happened and then attack occurred? Kind of the question, but did you see a shift when you're talking about strategies from like Facebook or Reddit or whatever these folks are on, and then they shifted operationally to something like more secure platform like WhatsApp or Telegram or Signal? Because even like in March of last year, I think the government exposed some of these media platforms, right? And then Signal and Telegram shot through the roof. within 1 month, they went from like, I think, 200,000 subscribers
Yep.
to several million, because that's a secure platform.
Yep.
And again, it's hard to track, because of the evaporative nature of those technologies. So
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you guys kind of look at.
I wish we could. The short of it is I wish we could. I mean, ethically, we're bound by research ethics boards or IRBs at universities, and I don't think they probably wouldn't feel too comfortable with us tracking users across platforms. I think my understanding is one of the best ways to do that is with IP addresses as best as you can, but no research ethics boards will give us that approval. Tech companies are definitely doing that, but we just haven't been, how do I put it? We work in small steps. We're like trying to understand a problem and slowly work our way into other problems, and we haven't gotten to that yet because we don't think we have the capacity to do it in a way that will not only be funded, but get published in a reputable peer-reviewed journal. It's an excellent point, because, I mean, that's, yeah. Something we're seeing a lot more now is not just people migrating from platforms, but people were on these platforms already before, so they're using these platforms all over the place, because there was this assumption that for a while that people were just jumping from platform to platform, but what we're seeing now is people are all over all these platforms.
And it kind of addressed kind of what she was talking about, like you're getting flooded with this stuff, right? From the law enforcement's perspective, nationally, right, is that we have agencies, but we're prohibited by Executive Order 1233, which is basically collecting information on U.S. persons. That's the challenge. That's not the challenge in looking at IPs for like overseas entities who are looking at, Times Square, right? We have that ability to do those things, but that's the problem.
Yeah, and I'll just say this. Yeah, that's a great point. I'm not coming to the rescue of tech companies by any means, but from my understanding, is their responsibility is if they see violent extremist content or anything that's perceived as a credible threat, they have to immediately hand it over to law enforcement agencies. The extent to which that gets done, I don't know.
Well, Brian, just for everyone's education, one of the supposings, or truth supposings we look in the future is, one is referred to as the British experience, and someone that actually spent their career in law enforcement, British or Britain, and how they respond to these type of things as well. Second one is what I'm referring to is the Israeli experience as well.
Yeah.
That were at a very high level. How do we respond to these type of things? And the cyber, I will tell you, get back to your question now about, okay, we know this stuff, so who cares, right? Kind of, I will tell you that recently, DHS made a large investment in the Center of Excellence just to study cyber attack on that. And it's run under the primary customer CISA for DHS, but they made a big investment to look at these type of things. That was recently awarded, I think, last August.
Was that to you?
You'll see
No.
things like that.
I'll take a question from Brian and then I'll jump back in.
Content moderation, that's basically the buzzword that Facebook's using to go in and essentially silence certain sources. Have you found that it's skewed the data that you're able to go in and track through the online sourcing?
I'm not looking at it in that capacity as of right now. I'll be completely honest. I focus on certain projects and learn as much about those as I can, and then perhaps I look at something in the future, like content moderation. It's an excellent point. Content moderation it's an interesting one, right? Because it varies by platform, by time, by space, kind of thing. I would assume, and it depends on the platform we're talking about here. If it's Facebook, for example, we're going to see higher levels of moderation than we would on like Reddit, for example. But maybe it's something we can talk about after. Yeah, it's a great point. It's a great point. So Vic kind of segued me into this idea around cyber attack strategies by far right, far left, and Islamist extremists. This is a project led by my colleague Thomas J. Holt, professor in the School of Criminal Justice at Michigan State, as well as colleague Dr. Joshua Freilich, professor at John Jay, as well as everybody knows Dr. Chermak. This was a project funded by DHS. I'm going to provide a very high-level overview of this project, and if you have questions that I can't answer, I'll direct them to my colleague. So, as the point I've hopefully made at this, hopefully I've made it pretty clear at this point is that there's an increase in research on terrorist and violent extremist use of the internet and associated technologies, which is mostly focused on the application of technology for radicalization and recruitment purposes, and to a lesser extent, fundraising and planning purposes. But this work has not been able to address the extent to which ideological actors may engage in targeted attacks against the online infrastructures that support commerce and communications between citizens, industry, and government. And this is in light of research that demonstrates that massive volumes of cyber attacks occur every year, not only in the US, but in various parts of the world, especially the Western world. Cyber attacks have caused substantial economic harms and losses of sensitive data information that affect citizens, corporations, and governments. So in response, Holt and colleagues developed the ECCD, known as the Extremist Cyber Crime Database. It's an open access data set of public information about nation-state and non-nation-state ideologically motivated cyber attacks performed against US targets from 1998 and 2008. And the purpose of creating this database in general is to address gaps in existing research as well as better inform policymakers. I'm not going to get into a lot of details about the inclusion criteria. Steve's done an excellent job of giving an overview of the ECDB, which is very similar to this. So the ECCD was developed by using a definitional framework similar to the ECDB, and with very clear inclusion-exclusion criteria for data. What I will say, in identifying instances, my colleagues searched over 120 separate sources and reviewed them closely to create a list of all known cyber terror attacks that satisfy their inclusion criteria. In terms of the coding, up until this point, they've developed 3 code books to make sense of the materials that they collected. One around the scheme, so they have 53 variables looking at things from the number of entities targeted, successful or unsuccessful, attack methods, ideology, so on and so forth. They've also looked at suspect characteristics, as well as targets of attacks. I'm going to present some preliminary findings. This project is ongoing. I'm not sure if I made a plug before, but it was funded by DHS, and it's continuing to get support from them. What my colleagues have generally found thus far is that extremist cyber crimes vary temporarily and by ideology. If you look on this table here, it's quite clear, for example, that most attacks occurred during the 2010s and accelerated since 2014. But if you look at the total numbers at the bottom, there is some variation in which ideology motivated the attack. And if you look down the column as well, you can look by year and see that there's definitely some variation there. The authors also found that the greatest number of attacks occurred in 2015, and if you look on that table there, it's largely the result of jihadi attacks, reflected by the ISIS's most prolific global growth. I'd argue between 2013 and 2015, they were real powerhouses, unfortunately, both on and offline. These preliminary results seem to reflect that offline trend, for example. Similarly, my colleagues found that far left had extended their engagement in both on and offline spaces, and you can see it in the results there. They had, a steady stream of attacks, if you will, and this reinforces prior predictions by DHS that this ideological movement would expand their activities online. Yeah.
Using the same definition of far left is.
This is Steve's.
So, well, this is not including BLM and Antifa and all that stuff.
It would.
Yes, it would.
It is.
Yeah, it would. Importantly, ideological cyber attacks appear to occur less frequently than traditional economically motivated cyber attacks, such as data breaches for the sake of fraud. But my colleagues would argue that with this increased frequency of ideologically motivated cyber attacks in the last decade, it may be a sign of future threats. As researchers, we don't know a lot about ideologically motivated cyber attacks. That's the reality of it. There really don't seem to be a high number of them, but we can't discard them nonetheless. So that's really what the just is here. My colleagues would argue that we need to keep an eye on this because this is most likely going to be a future thing, if you will. And lastly, the preliminary results seem to suggest that it's unclear why there are distinct differences in the frequency with which attacks occur across extremist ideologies. For instance, what the findings show is that the far left, their activity might reflect differences in operational knowledge and proficiency with technology. There's an argument to be made that people of far left views are probably more technologically sophisticated than people of far right. Jihadists are an interesting one. They have long been recognized to see the importance of engaging in cyber terrorism, though their capacity to effectively attack appears to be inconsistent, and I'd argue it's because there's a lot more focus on their online presence than on people with far right or far left views. So I'll make this last point and then jump into my research. One of the next steps for my colleagues is to do a qualitative analysis to better understand why and how certain individuals in this data engage in cyber attacks relative to their personal background, including things like their educational level, technological sophistication, and ideological stance. So I'm moving on to the last section here. So as a bit of a caveat, I framed it as examining posting behaviors and patterns of violent and nonviolent right-wing extremists. What I'm looking at here, though, is looking at the extreme or far right, and I'll explain to you why after. I'm leading this project, as well as my colleague, Wally Walasowski, assistant prof at MSU, as well as Josh, Steve, and Richard Frank, who's a computer scientist, a criminologist as well at Simon Fraser University in Canada. So, like most of us, violent extremists and terrorists often leave digital footprints online, including right-wing extremists. As a couple recent examples, Breivik was a registered member of a white supremacy forum and had ties to far-right social media sites. Dylan Roof allegedly posted messages on an extremist website and hosted his own website containing his own alleged manifesto. And most recently, Tarrant live streamed his attack online as well as announced his intentions and produced a manifesto there. In these cases, as well as jihadi cases, as well as left-wing cases, many researchers, practitioners, and policymakers raise questions about whether such violent individuals can be identified online prior to their attacks offline. But despite these ongoing concerns, one, few empirically grounded analyses have identified which online users have engaged in violent extremism offline and then assessed their digital footprints, and even fewer analyses have identified differences in the posting patterns or behaviors of those who share same or similar extremist ideologies but are violent or nonviolent. So, in other words, or in simple terms, research is overwhelmingly focused on identifying and examining radicals online and not those who adhere to radical beliefs but are violent as well. So what we did for this particular paper, it was last year, it was published in Journal Terrorism, Political Violence. If you're interested, I'd be more than willing to share the paper. We've also written what we call like insight blog posts where it gives you a quick and dirty summary of the key findings. For this particular exercise, we examined the posting behavioral patterns of both violent and nonviolent right-wing extremists within a subform of the largest white supremacy forum, Stormfront. Here we investigated if violent right-wing extremists are differentially active online compared to their nonviolent counterpart. And I'm going to answer these questions about why we picked this space, why we picked the extreme right, as I move along through. So, a little bit of background on the data. We examined postings made by the violent and nonviolent group in the open access section of Stormfront. We looked particularly at Stormfront Canada. As you can probably tell by my goofy accent, I'm Canadian. And I'll explain to you why we looked at Stormfront Canada after. But just in general, Stormfront Canada is a subforum or a smaller space within a broader space. It contains largely Canadian-themed content, but it is not restricted to Canadian users only. Stormfront in general is the oldest and largest racial hate site, and it's one of the most active to this date. It is starting to lose some steam and momentum, largely in part to these other platforms and a younger generation of extremists, left, right, moving to Gab and all those other spaces. But today, Stormfront includes over 365,000 users with over 13.9 million posts. So it's a big platform. And it includes an array of subforums addressing a variety of topics ranging from like culture, politics, ideology. There's like poetry corner, how to save or spend your money, tech talk, so on and so forth. There really are different strokes for different folks in these platforms. But probably most notably is that it has hosted some of the deadliest right-wing extremists since its inception. So it's not just a space where people who are like living in their mom's basement are spewing hatred. There are people in these platforms that have and will engage in violent extremism. So I'm not going to get into too much detail about data collection and sampling. What I will say, though, is that it proceeded in 2 stages. In terms of collecting the data, working with computer scientists, they automatically scrape the data, binned it for us. The subforum at the time that we collected included over 125,000 posts made by approximately 7,000 users between 2001 and 2017. 2017 is just a date that we last collected it on. We could collect it up until today, but we just collected it to that point for this particular exercise. Now, what a lot of you in this room are probably wondering, how can we identify violent and non-violent right-wing extremists? Well, so a former violent extremist who is actively involved in the North American right-wing extremist movement reviewed a list with me, reviewed a list of people who posted in a particular subforum who this individual was actively involved in when he was involved in, was a key player in the right-wing extremist movement in North America, as well as in Canada and the US. So he or she essentially had a pretty good sense, based on his network, who was who in the movement. And what this individual did, after I gave him or her a list, I was watching, he or she picked people who fit violent or non-violent. But each time that the former identified a user of interest, they were asked to explain why, in as much detail as possible. I really went at them, why they were identified as violent or non-violent. And they were asked to provide examples of the activities that each of these identified users engaged in, as well as their association or connection with them. I want to know how they were connected to them. How could they possibly identify this person as someone who engages in physical violence, for example? And this was done in an effort to verify the authenticity, and by extension the data, of each user identified by the former violent right-wing extremist. In total, I got about 30,000 posts. So the former identified 49 violent users and identified 50 non-violent users out of a list of about 7,000 users. And some of you are wondering, well, what's a violent right-wing extremist? So for this particular project, it was those who committed several acts of known physical violence on persons, including violent attacks against minorities and anti-racist groups, both sporadic and planned violence. And those who were non-violent were actively involved in right-wing extremist movement activity offline, such as rallies, protests, gatherings, but did not engage in physical violence on persons in any known capacity to the former extremists. And we can talk about the limitations of this after, I'd be glad to. But I think this is an interesting way to start to gauge posting behaviors based on violent or non-violent. I'm not going to go through the details of the measures, but we had a number of measures that we wanted to test it. We plotted the posting frequency, we did survival analysis, and logistic regression. I'm just going to cut to the chase with the key findings here. So interestingly, the first finding is around this idea of decreased posting behavior. One, we found that there was a general decline in posting behavior over time for all right-wing extremists in the sample, regardless of whether they're violent or not. You can see in this chart, you can see a steady drop there. And we also found that there was a steady dropout in posting frequency for approximately half the sample. Now, a lot of you are wondering, like, who cares? Like, why does this matter? Well, this is noteworthy because it suggests that right-wing extremists in our study, whether violent or non-violent, generally do not increase in posting behavior over time. And again, this is important because it contrasts with some research with kind of frames, including some of my older research, that kind of says, okay, you're going to go in these online spaces and you're going to just become this crazy active poster. You're going to explode. That doesn't seem to be the case in our sample, at least. Our findings tend to align with other empirical work, including some of my more recent stuff, which suggests that the majority of those who post in right-wing extremist online spaces tend to desist in and tail off their posting behavior over time. And our findings may obviously be a symptom of the study sample. Each user that was identified is either violent or non-violent, and they were actively involved in right-wing extremism in some capacity. They were on the streets engaging in something. So it's reasonable to assume then that posting in an open access subforum or space in general may have been a concern to users over time, given that their offline activities. They could have been engaging in violence, illegal activities, organizing rallies, flyering campaigns, so on and so forth. And research on online behaviors of right-wing extremists suggests that those who are actively involved in right-wing extremist activities offline are often concerned that law enforcement officials are monitoring their online activities and may in fact modify their posting behavior to avoid detection. Right-wing extremists in the current study were most likely doing that themselves. They might have been fearful that they're putting themselves in a vulnerable position to then be apprehended by law enforcement. Second key takeaway here is low-profile posting behavior, perhaps maybe the most interesting finding to everybody in the room. So from a policy perspective, our findings suggest that analysts who are searching for signs of violent extremism online should perhaps be less concerned about investigating high-frequency posters and more concerned about those posting fewer messages online. By no means am I saying don't investigate people who are super posters. Focus on the people who aren't posting as much as well. And this is because we found that violent right-wing extremists in our studies tend to be those who are much less active online than their non-violent counterpart. They tend to desist in their posting behavior, so they might be posting a lot at first, but then they slowly stop. And they tend to post just generally less over time. And so research has similarly found that violent right-wing extremists are clandestine, often paranoid because of the violence they engage in, and in turn might be concerned about revealing their identities. And similar to previous research that highlights how some violent extremists alter their online behaviors to avoid detection from law enforcement officials and others, the waning and interactive posting behaviors and patterns that we've identified here might reflect that security concern. I'm going to leave it there, I think, for now. I don't want to go over time unless Vic is willing to give me a couple more minutes. I'm not sure where Vic is. Does anybody have any questions for me right now? Okay.
Your database on this right wing or left wing, did like a law enforcement entity like run criminal history to kind of validate the fact that these people had a prior criminal history?
Yeah.
And same thing to your effect, you validate your online extremism, right, and jihadi, that like maybe somebody from the law enforcement will say run your list of folks against NCTC's terrorism database to say that, hey, you know, whatever, 200 of your folks, right, 75% of them showed up criminally in NCTC.
Excellent point. So in our study limitations, we discussed that. No, they haven't. But I think in order to further validate the authenticity of the data and get more of a sense of how violent people were or not violent, we need to be making those connections. We need to be connecting with law enforcement to get a sense of criminal histories. Just because a former extremist was able to identify at a specific period of time that this person did not engage in violence, it tells us the patterns are very interesting, but we're still not getting to some of like the key issues that we're interested in. One that we're really interested in, and it's just going to be a challenge to get this data, because getting this data alone is incredibly challenging. We're interested in kind of getting a sense of when people in this sample, for example, when they engaged in violence and what their posting behavior looked like before and after that. You know what I mean? Are there some kind of patterns around that? Are there some kind of ways that we can predict or get insight into what could be future trends, future credible threats? So the purpose of a lot of my recent work is trying to develop frameworks for law enforcement and tech sectors to think about identifying credible threats. It's an incredible challenge to try to identify a needle in a haystack. I didn't have time to present the next paper. This is a paper that just got published. This is a sole author paper from the same data. And what I did was I coded a sample of messages from the nonviolent, from the violent, and then for another comparative purposes, I just a sample of randomly posted messages from the same space to see what are the differences. I mean, okay, we're seeing some differences between violent and nonviolent right-wing extremist posting behaviors online. But is that different to people who post in that same space in general? And I am seeing differences. The nonviolents tend to be more ideologically motivated. They post ideologically motivated messages at a higher rate. And I think largely that's because that's what they see their role in as the movement. They see themselves as the ideologues who are providing the conceptual tools to then give to the more violent factions to do what they want with it. I'm finding that the violent are, again, less active in general in posting patterns, but they're not trying to mobilize to violence as much. They're not posting as much ideologically, and they're not posting as much about personal grievances, for example. But there's so much work we can do with this. I mean, half of the last paper, not half, a bigger proportion than what we normally do is on limitations in future research. Because what we're trying to do is try to get people to think about how do you develop these databases? How do we think about these complex problems that just haven't really been able to be addressed before? And we think that this is one way to do it.
I'll just go back to your question. The black hole you mentioned earlier, in between time, I think we can get at that, but we haven't. But getting at, what is your behavior up until right before the event? Were you online or offline? We have anecdotal stuff. Dylan Wolf right up to it, and others right up to when they committed the offense. There is a sort of almost at the same time they're still working it, and so there's not really a black hole. But I think that's an important question. The other question you raised is somewhat problematic only in terms of what our university research boards allow us to do, right? So we get criminal histories from other sources, but I couldn't go and ask somebody to run the names, right? In terms of getting that, and whether or not the same things. It's kind of, it's a different story, but the same problem that I had. I did a gang study in Indianapolis, and we were essentially asking probationers whether you're part of a gang. So we had good data on who were gangs, who were not. And the gang unit in Indianapolis wanted that to compare against theirs, and and we got approval to look at the connections, whether or not the people who were saying we were gangs were also on the gang list. And troublesome, their list wasn't very good, at least based on what we had. But a lot of times our review boards push back on that in terms of doing that. But I think it would be invaluable to think about.
No, and I'm not saying that they would give you the data. I'm just saying to validate, like,
just
to say, like, hey, of your 200 people, 75 were on our radar prior, right?
Yeah.
Know that. Yeah. And I think it would be valuable on the law enforcement side.
Definitely.
Again, getting back to that predictive analysis of, like, you have an event, political, whatever, right? Like the McVie thing with Waco, where that was a precipitating event for him. So you go online, you're dark, you come up on these other websites. And then there's a period of inactivity and maybe a political ruling of some sort. And then we have the criminal history, propensity to commit these types of activities, right? And you kind of already went over it down between knives and bombings and age group, right, medians.
Yeah, and it's an excellent point, and we'd love to have more granular details on the characteristics making up this sample. I was just lucky to be able to get access to this data, you know what I mean? So it started as just a pilot project to generate a conversation, and it's turned into something quite a bit more than that. So I'll be applying for funding to build out this database. So it's good. Thanks for giving us lots to think on. There are some questions over here. If anyone, we'll start with you, please.
Okay, so those that aren't posting as frequently, right? You've noticed kind of like they'll post and all of a sudden they kind of stop. Could it be that they are using maybe other platforms because there's only as law enforcement, I know what we've noticed is you have a group, they post, trying to mobilize, and then all of a sudden someone posts, hey, they're on to us, and then it stops. Are they using other platforms or other means on social media?
We haven't dug into that question. Anecdotally, I would say so. It seems to be the logical kind of response to that. I would say yes. There's a number of reasons why people could desist in posting. I don't know about you guys, but I mean, I don't blog at all, but I assumed if I did, I might get tired of it after a while and just kind of maybe jump to another platform or just stop altogether. There's a lot of different reasons that we just don't have. But it's a great point. I mean, they could be migrating to other platforms. They could be using other usernames. There's a number of different things there.
I know one of the challenges we face is we do the open source information. Then all of a sudden they set their profile private,
Yeah.
and we can't get that information.
Yeah, that could be another factor as well. It's an excellent point. Thank you. I saw some other hands up here. Yeah.
My question was kind of piggybacking off of his as far as like the verification of authenticity. Was it purely based off of word of mouth, or was it also verified through photos or known
Yeah.
articulated facts?
It was. I didn't do photos or anything like that because I mean I don't think people want to engage in violence and take photos of it. But what we did. So one thing that I did do is I just probably moved across it so fast, given this talk. I asked what his or her connection was with other people that were identified as violent or nonviolent, and in each case, he or she had a connection. The fact that this individual was only able to basically pick out 99 people out of 7,000 to me kind of says something about their ability to distinguish people. There were other people who could have potentially been in that list, but I didn't feel comfortable with their assessment of them as violent or nonviolent. Future research, in a perfect world, I could be able to interview numerous former violent extremists, but it's just so difficult. It's for anybody working in this space, it's very difficult to get somebody to talk to you in general. It's difficult to get a current or former extremist, current or former violent extremist to talk to you, but then get them to start picking people out of lists who they knew were violent or nonviolent. It's just, it's a headache. But the whole point of this exercise, which I think seems to be working, is just generating this discussion or generating ways for us to think about collecting data or in general making sense of extremist posting behaviors. In this case, looking at the extreme right. So thanks for your question. It's excellent. Yeah.
So, I see you guys are collecting a bunch of data, but honestly, like, how do you think it's actually gonna help law enforcement? Like, we already know who's doing it. We already know, like, they have to be computer savvy and all these things, but are you, like, coming up with ideas to shoot out to law enforcement? Like, hey, when you interview an individual, ask these questions. If you look through their phone, look for these applications, look for these websites. Like, are you guys throwing any of that out there? Because we already know who's doing it. We already know they have to be tech savvy.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
So it's like,
No,
why collect more data on something that's already known?
Yeah, no, it's
Why not
excellent.
throw out useful stuff?
No, it's excellent. I think I'll say in my capacity, I have a half-decent sense that that's the work that you're doing. I'm not trying to name names. You know what I mean? I'm trying to just look at large-scale data, for example, and identify patterns that are analyzed in a systematic, meaningful way to then hopefully inform what you guys are doing, who are on the ground, like actually nitty-gritty, have a real sense of who's who, to see if there are posting typologies or profiles that match with what you're seeing, for example. It's a bit of a difficult dance sometimes working with law enforcement. I'm always more than open to do it, but what I do at the very least is I don't just publish peer-reviewed journal articles that unfortunately many times don't get read by practitioners and policymakers. I also publish blog posts in reputable outlets such as the Voxpol Network of Excellence and GNet, which summarizes all of the key findings that is open access for folks like yourself and others to then perhaps make sense of. But I'm always open to collaborate or have discussions. That's why we're here.
And one of the things we're doing now is looking at suspicious activity reports, and whether or not they apply to this kind of sample, cyber samples, compared to other violent extremists, and what's present and what's not. And one of the things we're finding, which is really interesting, is that most of the things that they say you should collect, you just don't have. You don't have that information. You're spending a lot of time looking for things that you're not going to find. But here are the things that you'll find, and this is how to find them. And so those are the kind. So some of our projects, I don't know what, in terms of law enforcement, I think it's maybe interesting, but in terms of actionable, in terms of thinking about policy, but I think both of us, through these discussions, say, well, all right, maybe we need to do a better job in here, and maybe, when we talk about suspicious activities, this is how it really transforms to your work, in terms of where you spend time, and so that's really good feedback.
Manny, I have to cut it short, but I'll be here to chat all day. Sorry. Thanks everybody. I'll be around, and I really appreciate you guys all coming out today. Stay safe. Thanks.
Now, there were obviously a ton of great questions, and the questions, right, the resounding principle, a lot of the questions were, hey, it's great, it's research, but how does it help me now? What's it do for me now? I'll do. I was in that same side of the field for the longest time, right? When I was the sector chief in El Paso and in Tucson, it's great, when I would have a university in my backyard say, we want to do research. So how does it help me? Right? How does it help the men and women on that? And so that's a process is what I've learned, right? That's what intrigued me is be able to come back and say, hey, there's researchers that are brilliant and talented are looking to answer a question, a research question. And then as a practitioner, I have operational challenges that I need addressed. And so my role here at UTEP, to be quite honest with you, is try to bridge that gap between those two, right? To be able to come back. And you'll have folks like Ryan and Steve there that want to do that, want to bridge that gap, right? That's why they're in the School of Criminology, is they find that fascinating to be able to do that. And so what I've seen lately, at least from the Department of Homeland Security, is, hey, we got to bridge that gap. And they're spending a lot of money to be able to do that. So we're starting to see those things. This, though, gives you the realm of possibility. Okay? When I was sitting in those seats there, I didn't even know what was possible out there, to be honest with you. It's not till I got here and I said, man, I wish I would have known this stuff when I was in the Border Patrol. I wish I would have known who to contact and then say, hey, this is a problem set on that. Because you'll find people like Steve and Ryan that would love to speak to you, get some ideas on that, come back, and then tailor something in terms of what they're looking for funding is to be very applicable to you all. On that, so I know it's easy. I bring that up because it's easy to walk out and say, "Man, I was in class, right?" On that, and the idea was to kind of spur this conversation to be able to say, "Hey, I can have an impact on how this will impact me in the future in terms of work to be able to come back." Because when they're funded by Department of Homeland Security, Department of State, or other entities, on that, the intent on that is to provide a deliverable to them. That here's the research, here's some potential policy recommendations that will come back there, and ultimately the funding agency will have to decide how they go with it. But the beauty of it, though, is that you'll be able to hear some different perspectives, not only with this one here in person, but if you go to our website, this is number 18 of all the symposiums. You can go back and look at the other 17 and look at it and go, hey, that's interesting to me. And then the beauty of it, they all have their contact information. And I really do encourage you to give them a call. You'd be surprised how quick they'll pick up the phone to answer your questions and start that dialogue on that. So, like with all symposiums, this is geared for you, the practitioners, on that. And so again, the value, like I said at the beginning, was, if you'll take the time for a minute or two to fill out that survey, hand it to the students, it'd be very, very much appreciated. The other flyer that's in there, if it's an interest in terms of deadly mass shootings in the U.S. on that, I would encourage you to RSVP on that. And and if you have any thoughts of other topics, we'd love to be able to hear that on that. I know there are multiple questions. I promise I have coins, right, on that. If I don't catch you in that, you come back to me. I will trust you if you tell me you asked a question, right, on that. But that is an issue. I recognize some folks would be more than happy to do that. So thank you very much. You all be safe.
Thanks,
Thank you. Thank you.